I didn't sleep with anyone. I didn't touch anyone. I didn't plan to cheat, but I stopped sharing my thoughts with the one person who deserved them. I started editing my honesty before I spoke. I noticed myself choosing silence where there used to be openness. Nothing happened in my body, but something shifted in my loyalty. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I'm a woman in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We live together, we share routines, and we talk about the future like everything is fine. I wasn't looking for attention, excitement, or an escape. I wasn't unhappy enough to justify crossing any lines. That's why it took me so long to admit what was actually happening. Not an affair, not a secret relationship, just a slow change in what I chose to keep to myself. I started having thoughts I no longer shared. Conversations I replayed in my head instead of bringing home, and small internal decisions that felt harmless, till they didn't. If you've ever questioned whether honesty is only about actions, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real, uncomfortable, Reddit-style stories like this, subscribe and share the channel. At first, nothing felt wrong because nothing looked wrong. My days followed the same rhythm they always had. Work, errands, dinner, small talk on the couch. My partner still asked how my day was, and I still answered. Just not fully. There was one conversation that changed the way I listened to myself. It wasn't dramatic. No flirting. No compliments that crossed a line. Just someone noticing something about me that my partner used to notice without trying. The kind of observation that feels casual on the surface but lands heavier than it should. I told myself it didn't matter. People talk. People connect. That's normal. What mattered, I said, was that I didn't act on anything. But later that night, when my partner asked how my day went, I paused. Not because I was lying, but because I was choosing what not to say. I skipped over that conversation. Not intentionally at first. It just didn't feel necessary. Or so I told myself. That was the first time I realized honesty isn't only about truth, it's about instinct. And my instinct, for the first time in years, was to protect a thought instead of sharing it. Over the next few days, I noticed something unsettling. I replayed that conversation in my head during quiet moments, not because it was exciting, but because it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't noticed was missing. I wasn't comparing. I wasn't fantasizing. But I was curating my inner world. And once you start doing that, it becomes easier to justify the next silence. I still loved my partner. I still respected our relationship. But a part of me had quietly stepped back from the habit of full transparency, and I didn't know how to step forward again without admitting something I couldn't yet name. Was I wrong for keeping that first silence to myself? At what point does protecting a thought become a betrayal? After that first silence, I told myself it was a one-time thing. Everyone filters their day. Everyone skips details. I convinced myself that honesty didn't require full disclosure, just loyalty in action. But silence has a way of changing shape. It doesn't stay small. It stretches. And soon, I started noticing how easily it slipped into my routine. The conversations kept happening. Not constantly. Not secretly. Just consistently enough that I began to anticipate them. What unsettled me wasn't what was said. It was what I felt afterward. A lingering awareness. A quiet alertness I hadn't felt in a long time. I started paying attention to myself in moments that used to feel automatic. How I responded. How quickly I smiled. How present I felt when someone asked me a simple question and actually waited for the answer. At home, things hadn't changed on the surface. My partner was still kind, still familiar, still there. But I noticed something uncomfortable. I was no longer bringing my whole self into our conversations, not because I didn't want to, because I didn't know how to explain what I hadn't planned. There were thoughts forming that didn't have names yet, and naming them felt dangerous. One night, my partner noticed I was distracted and asked if something was wrong. I said no. Not because I was hiding an affair or a secret relationship, but because I didn't trust myself to explain the truth without making it bigger than it was. Or maybe without admitting it already was bigger. That's when I realized something that scared me more than temptation. I wasn't lying to protect my partner's feelings. I was lying to protect my self-image. I wanted to still believe I was the kind of person who didn't let these things grow, the kind of person who didn't need attention from outside her relationship to feel whole. But deep down, I could feel the shift. I was becoming more careful with my words, more selective with my honesty. And that carefulness wasn't about respect. It was about control. I started asking myself questions I didn't like. If nothing physical happens, does it still count as disloyalty? If no boundaries are crossed out loud, do internal boundaries matter? Because the truth was, I was already managing two versions of myself, the one my partner knew, and the one who held thoughts she no longer shared. And the distance between those two versions was growing quietly, without permission. Was I already betraying my relationship by protecting who I was becoming? Or was I overthinking something that should have stayed harmless? What surprised me most was how normal everything still looked. If someone had watched my life from the outside, they wouldn't have seen cracks. No late nights unexplained. No secretive behavior dramatic enough to raise alarms. Just a woman going through her days, showing up where she was expected to show up. But internally, something had shifted its center of gravity. I started noticing how often I paused before speaking. Not because I was unsure of my feelings, but because I was calculating outcomes. If I said this, would it open a conversation I wasn't ready to finish? If I shared that, would I have to explain why it mattered to me? So I chose the safer option. I kept things light, surface level, manageable. That choice came with a quiet cost. I caught myself thinking about how I used to talk to my partner, freely, without editing, how I would say something the moment it crossed my mind, trusting that we'd figure it out together. Now, I was doing that figuring out alone, and there was something intoxicating about that privacy. Not in a thrilling way, in a controlled way. It made me feel like I had something that belonged only to me again. I didn't realize how long it had been since I felt that way, until I felt defensive about it. The idea of losing that inner space made me uneasy, even though I couldn't justify why I needed it. One evening, my partner casually mentioned a plan for the future. Nothing big, just an assumption, something we had always talked about before without tension. This time, I nodded instead of responding. Not because I disagreed, but because my mind was elsewhere, running parallel thoughts I didn't invite him into. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not the plan itself, but my reaction to it. The realization that I was no longer instinctively sharing my inner reactions with him. Later that night, I thought about the other person, not in terms of desire, but in terms of contrast, how easy it felt to speak without history attached, how light conversations felt when they weren't weighted by years of expectations. That comparison scared me, because I hadn't meant to compare at all. I wasn't replacing my partner. I wasn't imagining a different life, but I was noticing how different versions of myself showed up depending on who I was talking to. And instead of correcting that imbalance, I started accommodating it. I justified it in quiet ways. Everyone needs space. Everyone needs thoughts that stay theirs. Not every feeling has to be shared. Those statements were true, but I was using them selectively. What I didn't want to admit was that my silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was intentional. And intention carries responsibility. I began to sense that if my partner ever asked the right question, I wouldn't know how to answer without changing how he saw me, or how I saw myself. That fear settled in my chest and didn't leave. Because the longer I kept these thoughts private, the more they shaped my decisions. What I said yes to, what I avoided, what I brushed off too quickly. And I could feel it. This wasn't just about thoughts anymore. It was about direction. At what point does protecting your inner world turn into quietly rewriting the rules of your relationship? And was I already past that point without admitting it to myself? The first real consequence didn't come from what I did. It came from what I avoided. I began to notice how often I redirected conversations at home. Not away from conflict, but away from depth. If my partner asked a question that lingered too long, I'd answer quickly and move on. If he shared something vulnerable, I listened, responded, and held back my own thoughts. It wasn't intentional at first. It felt like self-preservation. There was a strange comfort in knowing more than I was saying, in keeping certain reactions contained, unshared, unresolved. It gave me the illusion of control over my emotions, over the narrative of who I was. But control has a cost. The more I curated my honesty, the more disconnected I felt from my partner during quiet moments, not distant in behavior, distant in presence. We could sit side by side, talking about logistics, plans, responsibilities, and still feel emotionally out of sync. I wasn't pulling away physically. I was pulling inward, and I could feel the difference when I wasn't at home. With someone who didn't share my history, my past decisions, or my future commitments, I felt lighter, not freer, lighter, as if parts of me that had been dormant were being exercised again, without pressure. That realization made me uncomfortable enough to start questioning myself seriously. Why did ease feel like a threat? Why did familiarity suddenly feel heavy? I didn't want to answer those questions, because answering them meant confronting something deeper than temptation. It meant admitting that I had changed, and I wasn't sure I liked why. One night, my partner asked me directly if I was okay, not casually, not in passing. He noticed something. I hesitated, just long enough to matter. I said yes, and immediately felt the weight of that yes, because it wasn't fully true, and it wasn't fully false either. That's when I realized the most dangerous part of what I was doing. I wasn't lying outright. I was living in a space where truth had become flexible. And once truth becomes flexible, trust doesn't break. It bends, quietly, until one day, it doesn't return to its original shape. I started wondering what would happen if my partner asked me about the person I hadn't mentioned. Not accusatorily, just out of curiosity. Would I minimize? Would I deflect? Would I justify? And more importantly, would I recognize myself in those answers? Because at that point, the line wasn't about fidelity anymore. It was about integrity, and I wasn't sure where mine stood. Was I protecting my relationship by avoiding honesty, or slowly undermining it? If my partner sensed something was off, did I owe him clarity even if I couldn't fully explain it myself? By then, I had become fluent in a version of myself that spoke carefully, not cautiously, deliberately. I knew which topics felt safe, which questions I could answer without hesitation, and which ones required a pause before I responded. That pause became familiar, too familiar. It wasn't dramatic enough to feel like deception, but it was consistent enough to feel intentional. And intention, I was learning, is where responsibility quietly begins. I started noticing how often I replayed conversations in my head after they ended, not to relive them, but to review them. What I said, what I didn't say, what I could have said differently if the same moment came up again. That kind of mental rehearsal used to belong to important decisions. Now it belonged to everyday interactions. At home, my partner still trusted me. I could see it in the way he spoke freely, assumed continuity, planned without hesitation. That trust made everything heavier, because I wasn't just keeping something from him. I was benefiting from his openness while restricting my own. There were moments when I almost told him. Not the details, just the shift, the feeling that I wasn't fully present anymore, the sense that something inside me had become guarded. But every time I came close, I stopped myself with the same reasoning. I don't even know what this is yet. Why create a problem where there isn't one? That logic felt responsible. It felt mature. It also felt like avoidance dressed up as wisdom. What complicated things further was that nothing external escalated. No pressure. No demands. No boundary-crossing event I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. That absence of a clear turning point made it easier to stay exactly where I was. In the middle, between honesty and silence, between awareness and denial. I started to realize that I wasn't afraid of hurting my partner. I was afraid of being seen differently. I didn't want to be the kind of person who needed attention from outside her relationship to feel alive. I didn't want to explain a feeling that made me sound ungrateful or confused or selfish. So I chose the option that protected my identity, not our connection. The longer I stayed quiet, the more that silence began shaping my behavior in subtle ways. I was less spontaneous, more controlled, less inclined to initiate deeper conversations at home. Not because I didn't care, but because depth had started to feel risky. One night, lying next to my partner, listening to him breathe evenly beside me, I felt a wave of guilt that didn't come from anything I had done, but from what I was withholding. It hit me then that loyalty isn't just about where you go or who you touch. It's about where your honesty lives, and mine had slowly moved somewhere else. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted, because it meant this wasn't temporary, it wasn't harmless, and it wasn't neutral anymore. I was making a choice, every day, to maintain a version of peace that relied on partial truth. And I still hadn't decided whether that choice was protection or cowardice. Was I sparing my partner unnecessary pain, or sparing myself the discomfort of accountability? At what point does choosing silence become a decision that can't be undone? The longer this went on, the more I realized how much energy silence requires. It's not passive. It asks you to stay alert, to remember what you've said and what you've left out, to keep your internal story aligned with the external one. I started feeling that fatigue in unexpected ways. Small decisions felt heavier than they should have. I hesitated before answering messages. I caught myself rereading simple texts, not because they were inappropriate, but because I was checking my own reactions to them. That's when it hit me. I wasn't managing another person. I was managing myself. I became hyper-aware of my inner boundaries, what I allowed myself to think, what I shut down quickly, what I justified by saying, "This doesn't mean anything unless I let it." But meaning has a way of forming even when you don't invite it. At home, my partner started sharing more about his own stress, his worries, things he was carrying quietly, and every time he opened up, I felt a tightening in my chest. Not because I didn't care, because I knew I wasn't meeting him in the same place anymore. I listened. I comforted him. I responded with empathy. But there was a layer missing, the mutual vulnerability that used to define us. I was present, but guarded, supportive, but edited. One evening, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. Not about who, about me. He asked if I felt distant lately. I could have said yes. I could have explained that I was sorting through thoughts I didn't fully understand yet. I could have asked for time, space, patience. Instead, I said I was just tired. That answer worked. It always does. But something about the ease of that lie unsettled me deeply, because it meant I had found a shortcut. And shortcuts, once discovered, are hard to stop using. After that, I started wondering how many versions of the truth I was capable of living with. The one I told him, the one I told myself, and the one I avoided altogether. I noticed how often I framed my choices as not wanting to cause harm. But harm isn't always loud. Sometimes it's cumulative. Each moment of withheld honesty added weight to something invisible but growing. A distance that couldn't be explained by schedules or stress or routine. And then there was the question I kept circling without answering. If nothing ever changes, can this still be wrong? I didn't want to believe that internal shifts mattered as much as external actions, because if they did, then I had already crossed a line, even if no one else could see it. That thought terrified me more than temptation ever could, because it meant accountability without evidence, guilt without proof, a moral failure that only existed if I chose to acknowledge it. I started to understand why people don't confess these things, not because they're hiding something scandalous, but because they're afraid of admitting that they failed quietly, and the quiet failures are the hardest to explain. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that nothing was happening, not to my partner, but to myself. If my partner trusted me completely, did that make my silence worse, or more justified? Was I responsible for thoughts I didn't choose, but chose not to share? After that realization, I started paying attention to patterns I had ignored before, not just in my behavior, but in how I rationalized it. I noticed how easily I framed everything as temporary, just a phase, just a moment of self-reflection, just something I'd sort out internally and move past. That framing made it easier to avoid action, because temporary things don't require confrontation. They don't demand honesty. They just need time. But time wasn't dissolving this. It was giving it structure. I became aware of how often I checked my phone for reasons that had nothing to do with urgency, not obsession, not excitement. Just awareness, the kind that keeps part of your attention elsewhere. even when you're physically present. At dinner, I caught myself half listening. At home, I answered questions automatically. I wasn't absent, but I wasn't fully there either. That partial presence began to bother me more than anything else, because it felt like a quiet withdrawal I hadn't agreed to. There were moments when I tried to pull myself back in, to be more engaged, more affectionate, more intentional, and sometimes it worked, briefly. But then something would happen that reminded me how divided I'd become, a thought I didn't share, a reaction I softened, a feeling I processed alone. It wasn't about choosing someone else over my partner. It was about choosing myself, or at least a version of myself I didn't know how to integrate anymore. I started wondering when exactly things had shifted. Was it the first silence? The first edited truth? Or was it something older? Something unresolved that had finally found a place to surface? That question scared me. Because if this wasn't caused by one person or one interaction, then removing them wouldn't fix anything. That meant the problem wasn't external. It was internal. And internal problems follow you. One night, my partner reached for me in a small, familiar way. Nothing charged, nothing dramatic, just closeness. I responded, but I felt a hesitation inside myself that hadn't been there before. Not resistance, awareness. The awareness that intimacy requires presence, and presence requires honesty. That was the first time I felt truly afraid, not of being discovered, but of becoming someone who could maintain intimacy without full transparency, because that version of me felt different, more controlled, less open. I didn't like how comfortable I was becoming in that space. I realized then that this wasn't about temptation anymore. It was about fragmentation, about living in pieces instead of as a whole, about maintaining balance instead of truth. And balance, I was learning, can be just as dangerous as chaos when it's built on omission. I started asking myself a question I had avoided until then. If my partner knew everything I was choosing not to say, would he feel betrayed? And if the answer was yes, what did that say about the person I was becoming? Was I still the partner I believed myself to be? Or just someone playing that role convincingly? And if I didn't change anything soon, would this silence eventually make the decision for me? By this point, the weight of everything unsaid had become impossible to ignore, not because it demanded release, but because it had started to influence how I saw my own relationship. I found myself questioning moments that used to feel solid, not doubting my partner's intentions, but my own investment. I wondered when I had stopped bringing my full attention home with me. The most unsettling part was how subtle it all was. No dramatic shifts, no sudden loss of affection, just a gradual thinning of connection, like something stretched too far, too quietly. I began to notice how often I felt the urge to explain myself internally, to justify why I wasn't sharing everything, why it made sense to keep certain thoughts private, why this didn't mean what it could easily be mistaken for. That internal defense became automatic. And then something happened that forced me to see how fragile my reasoning really was. My partner made an offhand comment about trust. Not about me, not accusatory, just a general observation, said without weight, but it landed heavily. Because in that moment, I realized how much of our trust depended on an assumption, that we were still sharing the same internal space we always had. I felt exposed without being accused, guilty without being confronted. That's when it occurred to me that even if nothing ever came out, something had already changed. The foundation wasn't cracked, but it had shifted. I started asking myself whether honesty is only owed when there's wrongdoing, or if it's owed the moment your inner life stops being shared. I didn't want to believe the latter, because that would mean I had already failed in a way that couldn't be undone by simply stopping. Stopping wouldn't restore what had been withheld. I realized then that silence has momentum. The longer it lasts, the harder it is to reverse, not because the truth gets worse, but because the absence of it becomes normal, and normalizing absence is dangerous. I could feel myself standing at a crossroads I hadn't consciously approached. On one side, continuation, staying exactly where I was, managing, containing, controlling. On the other, disruption, introducing uncertainty, discomfort, and vulnerability into a relationship that had been stable. Neither option felt clean. Neither felt safe. That was the moment I understood something painful. Doing nothing was also a choice, and it was already shaping the outcome. I didn't know which path I would take yet, but I knew I was running out of room to stay undecided, because silence, when left unchecked, eventually demands a price. Was I obligated to confess something that had no clear beginning and no clear end? Or did choosing peace over transparency make me responsible for whatever came next? By the time I reached that crossroads, I realized how misleading the word choice can be. It implies clarity. It suggests two clean options laid out side by side. What I was facing didn't look like that at all. It felt more like standing in a fog where every step forward erased the ground behind me, where moving in any direction meant losing something, and staying still meant losing myself. I started imagining what honesty would actually look like. Not a dramatic confession, not an admission of wrongdoing, but a conversation that began with uncertainty. How do you tell someone you love that you've been holding parts of yourself back? Not because you planned to, but because you didn't know how to bring them home anymore. I pictured my partner's face, the confusion, the questions that would follow, and I realized something that stopped me cold. I wasn't afraid he'd think I cheated. I was afraid he'd see me as unreliable, as someone whose inner loyalty could shift quietly without warning. That fear said more about me than any outside interaction ever could. At the same time, I imagined staying silent, letting this fade, convincing myself that time would smooth things out, that distance would shrink on its own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true either. Because even if the thoughts disappeared, the habit wouldn't. The habit of editing, of deciding alone what was worth sharing. That habit had already changed how I showed up in my relationship. I noticed it in small, painful ways. How I no longer reached for my partner first when something emotional happened. How I processed reactions internally before deciding whether they were acceptable to express. How I had turned vulnerability into a private task instead of a shared one. That shift wasn't temporary. It was structural, and I had helped build it. One night, my partner asked me what I was thinking about. Not suspiciously, genuinely. The question hung between us longer than it should have. I could have said anything. Work, stress, plans, all acceptable answers. For the first time, I felt the full weight of the gap between us. The difference between what I could say and what I was actually thinking. I answered with something neutral, and immediately felt the familiar mixture of relief and regret. Relief, because I had avoided discomfort. Regret, because I had just reinforced the distance I was afraid of. That moment made something painfully clear. I was no longer choosing between honesty and silence. I was choosing between discomfort now, or disconnection later. And disconnection doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. I began to see how easily this could end without a dramatic breaking point. No explosion. No betrayal revealed. Just two people slowly becoming less known to each other. That possibility terrified me more than confrontation ever could, because it meant that even if we stayed together, we might not stay connected, and I had to ask myself the hardest question yet. Was protecting my sense of control worth risking the intimacy I claimed to value most? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew the moment for avoidance was closing. Something had to change. Either my silence or my courage. If honesty threatens stability, is it still the right thing to choose? And if I waited any longer, would the decision stop being mine at all? I didn't wake up one day suddenly brave. There was no moment of clarity, no inner speech that sounded wise or resolved. What finally pushed me wasn't courage. It was exhaustion. I was tired of carrying two versions of myself, tired of monitoring my words, tired of deciding, every single day, how much of me was allowed to exist out loud. I realized that even if nothing else ever happened, I couldn't go back to who I was before this, because the damage wasn't in the thoughts themselves. It was in how long I had chosen to live beside the person I loved without fully standing beside him. So I did something that felt both small and enormous. I didn't confess a crime. I didn't name another person. I didn't dramatize anything. I told him the truth in the only way I could. I told him I hadn't been fully present, that I had been holding things in, not secrets, but parts of myself. That somewhere along the way, I stopped sharing my inner world the way I used to. I watched his face change. Not in anger, but in confusion. And that hurt more than I expected, because confusion meant he hadn't seen it coming, which meant I had hidden it well. He asked questions I couldn't answer cleanly, not because I was lying, but because some truths don't come with neat explanations. I told him I wasn't trying to leave. I wasn't trying to replace him. I wasn't even sure what I had been protecting, just that I knew silence had started to cost us something real. We didn't resolve everything that night. There was no immediate relief, no clean ending, but something shifted. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. The distance I had created was finally acknowledged, not erased, but seen, and that mattered. I don't know what the future holds for us, whether this honesty will heal what silence strained, or simply clarify what was already fragile. But I do know this. Loyalty isn't only tested in moments of temptation. It's tested in the quiet choices to include or exclude someone from your inner life. And I failed that test before I ever realized I was taking it. Owning that doesn't make me innocent, but it makes me accountable. And for the first time since all this began, I feel like I'm standing in my relationship as one person again, not two. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.